Thank you very much for all those who have turned up this afternoon to join our panel, which will be interesting. Thanks to our three distinguished panelists. I would like to thank Gábor for organizing this conference and the whole NEPOSTRANS project for feeding us for how many years now, Gábor? 4, 5? Yeah, time flies. With lots of innovation and novel insights to motivate us to think about things in a slightly different light. This panel will try to do the same today. We have three distinguished panelists that I would like to briefly introduce. My name is Gergely. I'm with the Institute of History in Budapest and at ELTE, and I'm the least interesting guy on this panel, so no further words about me. Instead, I would like to start by introducing Professor Dóra VARGHA to you, who is a professor at Exeter University of History and Medical Humanities and of the History of Science at Humboldt University in Berlin, also associated with the Max Planck Institute as a researcher. She's a historian of medicine, science and technology, and she has held numerous research positions. I will only highlight the sort of most recent and most interesting ones, perhaps. I mean, her thesis was published in a book form on polio across the Iron Curtain, Hungary's Cold War with an epidemic. But then she sort of went on to broaden the perspectives and is currently involved in an ERC grant where she's the principal investigator titled Socialist Medicine, an Alternative Global Health History. She is also involved in a project with an, if I may say, even broader scope, perhaps, which is titled Connecting Three Worlds, and similarly deals in the history of health, but in a broader, more global perspective even. If I've said anything wrong, I encourage you to correct me. We have three very distinguished panelists, which makes my job of presenting them very difficult. Second, I would like to introduce Professor Béla TOMKA to you, who is a professor of history at Szeged University, and he has had numerous associations in his distinguished career. I will only highlight that he is a two-time president of the Hungarian Journalistan Society, which is, if you have any knowledge about Hungarian history, you will be aware that it's the highly prestigious association of social historians, more or less, who have been driving forward methodological innovation in Hungary, and Béla has been involved deeply with that, as well as being editor of ETAS, that has, as a journal, done the same for now 3 decades. He's the author of multiple books. I will only highlight what you probably know, but here's a reminder. He's the author of Social History of 20th Century Europe, which was sort of a trailblazing book when it came out. It's strange, but it's already a decade ago. More recently, he is the author of Austerities and Aspirations, which is a comparative study of growth and consumption in East Central Europe. And he has a very recent Hungarian book, which I think has at least partly informed his presentation today, which deals in globalization and East Central Europe during the socialist period. And last but certainly not least, a wonderful colleague with whom we have crossed paths multiple times, given that he also deals in things Habsburgs and post-Habsburg at times. Bálint VARGHA is at the Konferenciája University of Graz as an assistant professor of history, and he is the author of the very well-received book, The Monumental Nation, which is a complex cultural history, social history, and history of representations. You could call it many things, but a great study on Hungarian nationalism in its millennial moment. Since then, he has branched out into histories of emigration and immigration from the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, and also notions of empire and imperial orders in the late Habsburg period. That's what some of his more recent publications deal with. He is also, and this is relevant for us today, the editor of the book that you see in front of you. And it's something that has caused quite a stir in Hungary, and Bálint will talk more about that. So without further ado, let me just remind you that today, that this panel is on global history, which is an impossible task to talk about. So I do not envy you, but I know that you will acquit yourself admirably in the coming hour and a half or so. Bálint, please, if you would begin.
Thank you so much for the kind words, and thank you so much, Gabo, for the kind invitation to this event. In fact, I will talk today about this 2 volumes book and the lessons which I and my fellow editors learned while editing this enterprise. So the books I'm talking about are not completely ready yet. The blue volume, which is the modern one, appeared last year and was reprinted this year. And in a bit odd way, the first volume, which starts somewhere in prehistory and goes until the 1860s, is not completely ready yet. We are at the typesetting phase. In a few weeks, it will be most likely out. So in late October, you may have it in your hands. The template for the books was a French one, so we just copied a French model, which turned quite successful. L'Histoire mondiale de la France is a book that was published in 2017 by a team of French historians. It has been since then translated to English and Chinese, and in the following few years, several other iterations have appeared, mostly in the western parts of Europe. This is the list which I am aware of. It is not impossible. There are some other iterations as well, but so far, neither the French editors nor myself have been able to identify other volumes. The idea of the book is quite simple. What the French did, and also we did, and also the other similar book projects did, that we took a series of events and we tried to extrapolate those events to have a longer perspective, not only long duration, not only the time frame was quite long in most cases, but also it was crucial to have those events interpreted strictly through transnational, if possible through global lenses. Out of the more than 200 chapters, you just see here very, very short selection, just to have, just to provide you with a very, very simplistic idea what the book is about. There are several other types of chapters and several types, other types of topics which are covered in this book, in the book. The innovation was of the French book, and then what we also tried to did was that we consciously read Hungarian history not inside out as conventional national history does, but from the outside. So we focused on factors, on exogenous factors. This is how we call them, and on their impact on the local or national, and the interplay between the two, And at the moment, according to my best knowledge, due to its sheer size, this is the most comprehensive transnational account of any East Central European country and represents the state of the art of transnational historiography. I'm not sure whether I may extrapolate these findings to other East Central European cases, but I would be pretty much surprised if in a Czech or Polish context, the findings and the lessons would be radically different. Some alterations are certainly there, but huge variations I would not expect. What I would like to do now is just go a little bit behind the scenes and to give you a few ideas how the editorial work went, because it gives you an even even deeper understanding about the state of the art of transnational history writing at the moment. So the first major lesson is that Hungarian historians, regardless whether they are based in Hungary or abroad, are open to transnational approaches. And there is a robust expertise in transnational history in various forms that include comparative history, history of transfers, entangled history, and so on and so on. Without this robust expertise, it would have not been possible to write such a book project, which again consists of more than 200 chapters, and it has a length of more than 900 pages. However, this expertise is largely Eurocentric. This is what you won't see from the book, because the book is not Eurocentric anymore, or just a few chapters are. But in the original submissions, we encountered quite often that a Eurocentric perspective. Eurocentrism itself is not evil, I think. It would be quite simple to call it evil. In some cases, it makes complete sense. Just take things like the making of the Christian monarchy around 1000. We have, of course, a chapter dedicated to Saint Stephen I, the first Christian monarch of Hungary, where the author Gábor Toroczkai interprets this event in the context of, let's call it East Central European and the Nordic European Christian state formations around the same age. Here, the European perspective makes absolutely sense. Or the Reformation. It is obviously something which started in the 16th century in Europe, in the German lands. Then it went beyond, but the major frame for the 16th century Reformation is still Europe. Western Europe, we can actually add. Nonetheless, for the majority of topics, in particular after the 16th century, European perspective is definitely misleading. And we received quite many submissions with the Eurocentric and the European diffusionist view. And this is what then we, together with the authors, try to rewrite and develop further. A transnational approach in these cases often meant that they measured Hungary against a West European yardstick. Southeast and East Europe are, in this line of thought, often used to counterbalance Hungarian backwardness and to put Hungary on the middle of the slope, backward against Western Europe, but progressive measured against the even more eastern peripheries. In this Eurocentric, or better said, Western Eurocentric perspective, the non-European word is often reused to an exotic footnote if it is mentioned at all. This interpretation and this contextualization is firmly rooted in Hungarian and for sure in other East Central European intellectual traditions. And perhaps the most significant tide of this contextualization came along in the 1980s and 1990s, when East Central Europe was seen as the kidnapped Europe, words of Milan Kundera, and this perspective enjoyed a very wide acceptance and laid also the intellectual foundations of an anti-communist and anti-Soviet politics in the, before the transition, and the pro-EU and pro-NATO politics in the 1990s. The political stakes behind this Western Europe-centered perspective are today perhaps less palpable, but Eurocentrism remained. Just give you a very short personal example. I went to high school in the 1990s in Budapest. I went to a very conservative, patriotic, if you like, nationalist high school. I had a great history teacher, and he took the liberty to ignore the official textbooks. Instead, he took the book series Magyarok Európában, Hungarians in Europe, which was a very nice cultural history written for an educated readership. And that was a transnational book per definitionem. It was, but the purpose of this was to retain the picture that Hungary belongs to Western Europe. It belongs, since I went to a Protestant high school, it belongs to Protestant Europe in several ways. And whatever else was east of Europe, it was just practically an irrelevant footnote. Now, I would say that these political stakes are less relevant today, but Western Europe-centered perspective are still relevant. And the editorial team encouraged the authors who wrote in this manner, in too Eurocentric manner, to widen their scope. And actually, most of them did this job very nicely. So in the end, at the end of the day, the book is, in most cases, you won't see this Eurocentric perspective anymore. But what have we gained by broadening our horizon? I would like to give you one very concrete example. Stock exchanges, as author Judith Clement in her excellent contribution argues, signal the fact that a certain economy has entered or is about to enter the mature phase of capitalism. So wherever you find a stock exchange, it means that the surrounding area is already either in or already or almost there to have a mature capitalist economy. The Budapest Stock Exchange was established in 1864. Now, if we interpret this date and the foundation of the Budapest Stock Exchange surely on a European level, then you will see a very obvious proof for the Eurocentric and diffusionist view of history. Stock exchanges were first established in the early modern period in the Northwestern European large capitals, financial capitals. Then later in Vienna, so in cities which were imperial capitals, but perhaps less important nodes in the emerging capitalist economy. And then from the mid-19th century, we have a tide like Geneva and Stuttgart, so minor economic centers. Then it goes to Hungary, and then further Istanbul and Athens and Bucharest, so to the southeast, and to smaller places, economically smaller places like Prague. If we just take these cities and this list, then this is the obvious proof for the leading West and for the view that the blessings of the West just spread around the world. But if we completed this with a global picture, then we arrive at a quite different conclusion. The rise of Hungarian capitalism, as is obvious from this list, coincided also with Latin America, another semi-periphery in the world economy, also with major economic hubs of the British colonies in Canada, India, and Egypt. Then we can see South Germany, Stuttgart, and the Midwest, Chicago, as internal peripheries of Germany and the United States. And also the rising Japan is on the same list. So just this chronology, this global chronology, questions a simple Eurocentric diffusion and puts Hungary and East Central Europe on par with several regions on a global scale. If we do this exercise for all other topics mentioned in the book and for any topics which we historians deal with, then we'll come certainly at different conclusions and different trajectories. In some cases, a European diffusionist view would be sustained and would not be challenged. But in the most cases, I assume that this Eurocentric view would not hold. Now, what are the toolkits which shall be employed to globalize East Central European history, and which are the lessons how we thought we could work? I think that no Wunderwaffe is needed, so we don't need to develop any very particular, very innovative methodology. Just, but a few methods are essential. So first, we shall really be conscious for global contextualization, and if possible, then take a post-colonial approach and terminology very serious. So in several submissions, we received terminology and wording like Christopher Columbus, who discovered America. Well, this is not in the book anymore, because this wording is not only politically incorrect, this is the minor issue, it is just sheerly incorrect on a very, very factual basis. So just these sensitivities, taking seriously these sensitivities would already improve our level of writing in many ways. Second, if case studies and source-enabled entangled histories are an obviously welcome method. And for that, actually, raw material is abundant. For instance, several global biographies have been already written. However, in the region, it is quite often the case that in very old-fashioned ways. Take, for instance, Emil Holub, who is not in the book because he was a Czech. Holub was a Czech medical doctor, and he was a very well-known traveler in South Africa in the 1860s and 1870s and 1880s. Upon returning to the Habsburg monarchy, he became a kind of professional celebrity, and he lived on being the man who saw Africa. And he actually lived on these shows, where he just showed his own travel experiences. By the end of his life, around 1900, his fame already waned. But in the Czech Republic, he's still regarded as a national hero. He's a household name still today. Quite many books have been written about him. I think also a movie was made about him. But in these traditional Czech interpretations, Holub is not interpreted as a person who has anything to do with the colonial order on the white side, on the British side. But he is regarded as a pioneer and an explorer without any stakes in colonialism. There is a current exhibition in the Nápistek Museum, the Museum of Ethnography in Prague, and that exhibition, as far as I heard, interprets Holub through a slightly more critical lenses, and it has already caused a public outrage. Because he is linked to the colonial order just a little bit, but still that was enough to question his innocence. And as a curator of the exhibition explained me lately, the director of the museum gets angry emails on a daily basis since then. So I think that the raw material for instance, global biographies is absolutely there, but a more cautious and generally global approach shall be applied to refresh them, to make them meet the standards which we are talking about. The second methodology shall be comparative methodology, because this is a fact that the entanglements between Britain and its colonies, France and Africa, are obviously far more robust than the entanglements between East Central Europe and the exotic parts of the world. Therefore, entangled histories are not always possible, but if not, then comparative methodology comes into the picture. And the lesson of this book is that, in particular, comparison with Latin America and other semi-peripheries of the world seem quite promising. Several chapters in the book demonstrate the deep structural parallels between these macro-regions, and I believe digging into details, in particular in economic history, but also in other subfields, would be quite promising. The gains are obvious, but the road leading there seems quite complicated, because thinking on a global scale requires financial, intellectual, and human resources that seem rather scarce at the moment. Financial, because access to literature, access to sources, primary sources, and so on costs a lot of money. Intellectual, for instance, language skills. I would encourage now emerging young scholars to study languages which are less obvious for the study of East Central Europe, but an intellectual and innovation into languages not being that obvious for the region can be actually quite promising in the long run. Also, human resources. So for that, one should meet people who have interest in these matters, and at the moment, this seems to be also quite a narrow path. Furthermore, a global approach to history may count on definitely less backing from policymakers. At least this is the case in Hungary. These global histories which do not offer a clear-cut picture of the world, but which are decentralized and where the connections are not as obvious as in the Hungary-Western Europe case. They don't really feed any political agenda, or perhaps they feed one which is not welcome, at least in this country, where a strong and rather inward-looking government is in power, and as history is mostly publicly financed, I would be skeptical whether, on the long run, this kind of history writing can count on financial or infrastructural support from the government. This book actually was done practically on the initiative of the editors, and it was financially supported only by the market. So it was the publisher's risk to do this book. It works, but I'm afraid that less popular books, which are more specialized, may meet this political risk as well. I hope that the other contributors will have some technically also more positive and optimistic view, and they can counterbalance this realistic approach. Thank you so much for your help.
I mean, Bálint, the counterbalance is the book itself in many ways. So thank you for the work you did, and especially for this presentation today. We're moving on, and then we'll have a discussion and questions once, of course, all the presentations are done. So, Professor TOMKA, Béla, if I may ask you to continue.
Thank you very much. And I would also like to say thank you to the organizers for putting together this excellent event. Well, I would like to talk about socialist globalization, applying a particular point of view. Namely, I would like to deal mostly about some recent developments in the related research. I would call it a turn in research. It will turn out why, and it will also turn out that I am somewhat critical of these new development in the historiography. By way of introduction, I would like to draw your attention to a fact related to the discourses on socialist globalization. This might sound somewhat counterintuitive. However, it's true that in much of the related literature, or at least for many observers, East Central Europe is one of the most globalized regions in the world today. There are several quantitative surveys, for example, the so-called COF Globalization Index compiled by the Swiss Institute of Economics in Zurich, which rank the Czech Republic and Hungary among the most globalized countries. For example, this COF survey among the 13 most globalized countries, and other studies or other indices, related indices, for example, the Maastricht Globalization Index, just support these findings. In addition to this, there are several authors that formulated strong arguments about the process, the globalization process in Eastern Europe and more narrowly in East Central Europe, and the impact of this process concerning the world and Europe in a more narrow sense. For example, James Mark, who is leading the so-called Exeter group dealing with the history of globalization. So, for example, James Mark suggested that 1989 was a kind of teaching moment for the world because the regime changes in Eastern Europe taught the world, especially the global South, that there is only one viable developmental path, and that's the Western path of development. Or Besnik Pula, who wrote an influential book about the globalization in Central Europe, I will come back to this later, suggested that East Central Europe, socialist East Central Europe, was an important co-producer of globalization. Philip Ter, in his award-winning book, also claimed that the global transformation or the globalization rather, of East Central Europe had a significant impact on the Western European labor market. Namely, it pushed towards, this labor market pushed towards the neoliberal direction. And finally, this is my last example. Ivan Krastev claimed that the globalization of post-communist East Central Europe was closely related to the surge in populism in the region. These exampple referred both to communist and post-communist East Central Europe, but quite remarkably, the most systematic and most sophisticated accounts of East European globalization and East Central European globalization published so far covered the communist era, so not the post-communist era. And this is a somewhat unusual situation in my view, that the historical phase of globalization, the past phase of globalization or any kind of social phenomena is more systematically researched than the recent phase of this process. Quite immodestly, I launched a project to fill some of these gaps, and I would like to write a book about the globalization in Central Europe after the regime changes. This presentation first would raise some methodological concerns related to this project and in fact to almost any kind of history of globalization. Secondly, I would give a very short overview of the project. Basically, I would present the content of the planned manuscript, and in the substantive part of this presentation, I would focus on one aspect, namely the globalization in East Central Europe during the socialist period. And as I just indicated, I would concentrate on the historiographical developments and the results, my results, research results related to this process of globalization in East Central Europe would just supplement this part of my presentation. Methodological issues are, of course, very intricate. In an article, one of the colleagues collected more than 150 definitions of globalizations. In my view, most of these definitions are redundant because they only concentrate on one single factor. In my view, the definition of globalization should include at least three major areas. First, globalization can be understood as the intensification, or should be understood as the intensification of worldwide flows or interconnectedness, the intensification of interconnectedness. Secondly, the definition should include the growing interdependence of the societies throughout the world. And finally, the third dimension of globalization, in my view, is the rising awareness of all these, as Robertson put it, the intensification of consciousness of the world as a whole. Of course, there are several other major issues, methodological issues, that should be handled cautiously. It's very difficult to differentiate globalization, transnationalization, and internationalization. In theory, we can do that, but bad news is that in the actual research practice, it's almost impossible to differentiate globalization from transnationalization or internationalization. So these are only some indications that there are really problematic or complex methodological issues we have to deal with if we are looking at the globalization process. We can come back to this, of course, in the later stage of this panel. As to the structure of my planned manuscript, these are the major chapters. First, I would like to deal with the historical antecedents, mainly socialist globalization. Then another chapter would cover the timing and dynamics of the processes in East Central Europe. Next one, the gates and barriers to globalization, the gates of and the barriers to globalization in the region. I should handle the disparities of globalization in East Central Europe, the diversity of East Central Europe in that respect. Also, major actors and attitudes towards globalization should be included, and of course the discourses, diverse discourses on globalization in the region. Finally, the outcomes should be considered if the result is homogenization or hybridization, localization, etc. And I will also study the unity of the region in that respect, if there is an East Central European pattern of globalization. So I would like to concentrate, as I just suggested, on the globalization in the socialist period in East Central Europe. I already have some publications about this. A small book just came out, and in the October issue of the European History Quarterly, review article will also come out related to this topic. As we all know, the mainstream literature has portrayed Eastern Europe, and more narrowly East Central Europe, as an isolated entity during socialist times. And this isolation was both intended and unintended. Intended because the autarky was more or less constant goal of the decision makers in the region, and unintended because the Western world, especially the United States, tried to isolate Eastern Europe from important technologies, COCOM list, etc., etc. There were alternative interpretations to this mainstream approach. such as the word system theory, but these alternative interpretations were not as influential, of course, and for a large part they are also problematic. I would also add that most of the related literature is very implicit about globalization. No wonder, because the very word of globalization was introduced in the 1980s. So in the late socialism, the phenomenon, of course, existed earlier, but the conceptualization did not happen in the 50s or 60s in that way. However, in the last couple of years, we have seen a surge in interest in socialist globalization. Several influential books have been published by Besnik Tula or the group led by James Mark. I just mentioned this name earlier. So once again, this is a very well-researched area, and what is really important to us in that respect, these newly published books published in the last, say, 5 or 8 years, these books presented a kind of counter-narrative, a narrative against the mainstream approach I just outlined. These are some of the flagships, the most influential books published by prestigious publishers. For example, the Socialism Goes Global, published by Oxford University Press, also the 1989 A Global History of Eastern Europe, published by Oxford University Press. I would like to give you some indication how, or some examples, how these books cover globalization, or what what kind of new propositions they have related to the globalization process in the region. My first example comes from Besnik Pula's book. Trade and reform policies during the socialist period created the organizational and institutional basis for the region's economic globalization in the 1990s and 2000s. Or also by Pula, proto-globalization signifies a period when socialist industry began a process of integration with Western industry in a way that went beyond ordinary trade of goods. This is the very term socialist proto-globalization is an innovation by Pula. The next quotation comes from the book Socialism Goes Global, I just mentioned. The last decades of the Cold War, in fact, saw the deglobalization of the region and the retreat from the claims to leadership on the global stage. Or the quote from the other book, the collapse of communist-ruled polities thus did not represent the entry of Eastern Europe into a global economy. 1989 should be understood as the culmination of an engagement with what was called an interdependent world economy that communist elites had themselves encouraged. It was also a choice about the form that such globalization should take. These are highlights, of course, but I could quote several similar sentences from these and other books. I think these quotes are enough to demonstrate that a kind of revisionism are taking place in the literature, a kind of, and we can also plausibly argue that a new canon has been emerging, and this canon suggests that Eastern Europe was much more globalized. Communist or socialist or state socialist Eastern Europe was much more globalized than previously assumed. There are some predecessors to these newly formulated views. For example, Sanchez-Sidoni, etc., formulated similar propositions somewhat earlier, but these new books I just indicated, and the new line of argumentation in the literature is much more explicit and comprehensive and systematic than the ones we can find in previous works. If we deconstruct the argumentation, the revisionism takes place in three major areas. First, these books suggest a different dynamics of globalization in Eastern Europe and more narrowly in Eastern Europe. This means that the globalization was more vigorous than previously assumed. There was a conscious policy of globalization in these countries, etc. So the very term of alternative globalization is plausible according to these works. And secondly, the different dynamics means that the globalization in the region followed a particular time pattern. It declined from the 1970s. As James Mark put it, alternative global visions were hollowed out from within. I am going further with the deconstruction. So I think the second major area of the revision is the specific structure of globalization in Eastern Europe. These books and these contributions suggest that the globalization in Eastern Europe was peculiar because of the expansion of links to the global South. These links were very diverse, very significant, and they argue somewhat implicitly, in other time explicitly, for the great significance of these links to the global South. The very term alternative globalization mostly means that kind of connections. The alternative globalization, as they call it, were able to counterbalance the limitations of the relationships of the socialist countries to the Western world. Actually, this is somewhat consistent with trends in Cold War research, but I cannot go into details right now. And the third major area of revision is that the role of the regime changes are questioned in the globalization process. The proto-globalization, the term of the proto-globalization formulated by Pula, needless to say, puts emphasis on the continuity between the socialist globalization and the later stage or the post-communist globalization. They also talk about the choice. This is the choice, the possibility to select the alternative or other way of globalization in these East Central European countries. In my view, these are the books and the other contributions I refer to are great academic achievements. They cover a lot of new themes, such as social movements or the healthcare, the globalization of healthcare, etc. And they really deeply go into the connections of the socialist countries to the global south. So these are significant achievements. However, I see several shortcomings in these new approaches. First, that they mostly engage in cultural and diplomatic history. The actors are somewhat, the treatment of the actors are somewhat selective. Mostly cultural elites, politicians, diplomats are the actors in these books, and the impact on the broader segments of the socialist societies is missing. It's symptomatic that, for example, they simply ignore the travel as or the movement of people in that respect. Even the economy is largely ignored. They cover the so-called developmental assistance, but this is mostly about the discourses. So how the socialist or state socialist countries are planning to help by economic assistance, but how it actually proceeded and what the significance of this assistance was, these are neglected. I also have some problems with the key concepts of these books, primarily with the concept of the alternative globalization. I can also come back to this point if you wish later. Also, the continuity is questioned. The continuity is supposed, and if there is a continuity in that respect, then there are serious questions. There might be serious questions what the causes of the regime changes were, what the determinants of the post-communist transformation were. So I think if we formulate these questions, then the only way to go forward is to do empirical research, systematic empirical research, and this is what I try to do in my book, just refer to, and in other manuscripts. I have been surveying 4 major areas: the movement of goods and services, basically trade, capital, information, and people. I don't know how many minutes I have. I still have nothing. Okay, actually I made the caveat in advance that I will not really cover the substantial results of my research because it can be very technical, so I cannot really put this into 5 or 10 or 30 or 60 minutes. So that's why I just show you, I give you some slides and to give you an impression how I argue. So if we look at the development of trade openness of these countries, there is a quite obvious cleavage around the regime changes. The same in the case of capital movement. These are systematic data, so not, how should I say, anecdotal evidences. This is how I would like to argue. Of course, the treatment of information flows is much more complex than trade, than the coverage of trade or the flow of capital, because, well, information is related to almost everything. So in that area, we have to select some proxies. This is not a simple procedure if we wish to tackle the problem in the long term, because the mediums of information flow, the medium of information flow have changed a lot. But the results are consistent in that sense as well. And here are the results. So in my view, the revisionism is hardly supported by the findings. Globalization was special, peculiar in East Central Europe, but was relatively moderate, very selective, fragmented, and it had a very limited social impact. And yes, that's it.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to remind ourselves that sometimes you just have to read the book. There's no way around that. But thank you very much for that very insightful presentation. Lots of questions. We'll see how much time we'll have to discuss them. So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Professor Varga. Dora, if you please, and I will explicitly not tell you to try to make up on lost time, because that would not be fair. So I'm actually letting Dora present as she would. Hopefully we'll still have time.
I think I can finish by dinner. Yeah, thank you so much for that. And actually, we didn't rehearse this, but I'm kind of going to connect to the two speakers before. What I would like to do is talk a bit about the history of medicine and global health to a room full of people who I suspect rarely venture into this area. And I'm going to try to convince you to do more often, partly because what Béla was talking about of what he's missing in these histories is exactly what we've been doing for quite a while, but there are these silos that prevent these conversations, and I think we should have more of that. And of course, that, with the exception of some of the most prominent young researchers sitting in the back, who are Hungarian historians of medicine, who I think you should look out for, Viola Lászlófi and Janka Kovács. So what I'd like to do is tell you a bit about these two projects that I've been leading in the past couple of years, and it's still ongoing, and we're still kind of in the middle of it. So I think in a couple of years we'll do a similar kind of conference to see where it's taken us. And then I would like to talk to you a bit more about what that means for global health history and for socialism and Eastern Europe. I'd like to talk a little bit of our methodology and some of the challenges. I'm going to try to keep it very brief. Just about the two projects, what I think Bálint was already pointing out, to write the global history of anything needs collaborative work. It needs a lot of money if you want to do it right, and it needs a lot of people. And I'm in a very privileged position to have all of that right now for a limited number of years. I don't have that much time, but we can do what we can with the resources we've got. So there are about 15 people involved in the two projects together. If you count collaborators, advisory board members, and so on, who are also involved in some ways, then it's well over 20 who are working on this. This is two interconnected projects that aim to integrate the socialist world into the global health history. And I'll tell you a bit about that in a minute. Both are coming to it, and this is, I think, a wider point of how do we write the global history of anything, coming to it with two alternative ways. Connecting Three Worlds is a collaborative project that is focusing on networks, global networks, socialist networks. While Socialist Medicine, which is the ERC project, is focusing on, has a thematic structure. So looking at, what we're doing is looking at 4 key ways in which the history of global health has been told through international organizations, through aid, through the pharmaceutical and medical market, global medical marketplace, and through health systems. And we turn them on their heads and see what it looks like if we look at it from a different point of view. What we're doing in both projects, what we're doing in both projects is explicitly not leaving out, but not focusing on the Soviet Union or the United States, who are the usually key players. And the need for these projects came from the realization that really the way that we tell the history of global health, and I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of these tellings right now after the pandemic, of what we're surrounded by, what kind of institutions are working, who are having a stake in our lives. That is built on narratives, and the understanding of what is going on right now is built on the understanding that is almost exclusively told from an American perspective, a Western European perspective, and a colonial history and post-colonial history perspective. 1/3 of the world has been missing. What we want to do is put it in and see, shake it up and see what comes out. And of course, it's in conversation with a lot of the scholarship that Béla just highlighted. And this, the way that these narratives have been formed, I would say, really show the stubbornness of the Cold War and Cold War narratives of how we cannot see behind certain things and certain ways we tell stories. These are also very political projects. Obviously, since they have to do with health, they have to do with socialism. This is political not only in this country. It would certainly not be possible to do all this research in Hungary right now. If we succeed, we will make everybody unhappy, and this is kind of our aim. So we're not presenting a celebratory, glorified view of socialism and health. So we're making all the left and the activists unhappy. At the same time, we're very much challenging entrenched narratives, current structures, priorities, both in history writing and in global health. And what is, I think I'll just change to this. Sorry about that. So basically, and I'm going to talk a bit more about the methodology, but our presumption is, and our working hypothesis, as we like to call it, to the funders, is that there is something about socialism and health. There is something about socialism that makes health particularly an important aspect of it, and something that actors, maybe politicians, thinkers, practitioners, activists feel that they have something very strong to say about it. And there is something about socialism that helps us to understand the health. So it kind of works both ways. We're trying to kind of blow up everything a bit. And this is very much a project, like, I think what Bálint is working on, and Béla, like just rewriting the history of everything at the same time. So we're taking apart, using this, not socialism and what the global is, not as categories of analysis, but something that we want to use the project to understand. So we're using health to understand this. And we found, particularly as a starting point, useful Matt Savelli's proposition, where he was talking about socialism by default and socialism by design. So when is health, when is something socialist, either it's happening in a state socialist country, it has nothing to do with ideology. It's just maybe the socialist structures are giving way to certain connections, or or maybe it just happens to happen there geographically. Socialism by design is something that is really, there's some kind of idea about it, some kind of intention. It may not be happening in Eastern Europe. It may not be happening in a politically socialist country, could be anywhere. We added socialist by convenience, where it's that kind of cherry picking. Oh, we need to solve this problem. Look what the socialist ideas about it exist. We'll just take that, but we don't want to engage with the rest of this socialist thing. There are intermittent socialism. So you know, what is the socialist world, which is a very big challenge in our project. They come, you know, there are some flashes in the pan, some socialist regimes that only exist for a very short time and disappear. We're engaging with that as well, and socialism in the interstices. So in the, you know, cracks and crevices where you can find it. So this is not like one monolith idea. We are going with actors' definitions and following, you know, what they are saying and what they're thinking. It's also an opportunity to think more about what global is in global history, when and where it begins, who is, you know, belongs there, where does it take place, who are its actors. So, and in that way, which brings me to particularly that reviewer comment, peer review comment I got. Why is Eastern Europe a global history? That's not global history. That's, you know, that's something else. And obviously we disagree with that. And you know, the two previous talks are just prime examples of that. So what we're doing is focusing on socialist countries and their global relations. It's somewhere in the kind of combination of what Bálint and Béla were talking about. We're not looking outward from Eastern Europe. So as you said, we're not looking outward from the national perspective, but kind of connecting it. But we're also not stopping in Central and Eastern Europe, even when we're looking at connections. So, you know, what happens to Global South connections that no longer exist? Well, we go into the Global South and see, you know, what are the imprints, what are the legacies of, you know, Hungarian physicians who were all over the world working in hospitals, for instance. What are the people doing and how are they thinking and practicing medicine who were trained in Moscow, who were trained in Prague or Budapest, and so on and so forth. So what are these structures, physical structures that were left behind? So there is basically state socialist countries in Eastern Europe, and however we want to understand that category, is basically placed as one among these many sites. And just to give you an idea of what the sites are that we're currently working on, and we're not aiming for a comprehensive, we're not going to tell you the history of, it's a kind of, these projects are pushed to start this work that is absolutely missing. So among these projects are research on the FARC in Colombia, who had basically built a healthcare system independent of the state, where there is no state, you know, what kind of ideas and connections we can see there. Reproductive justice and indigenous women in Ecuador, primary healthcare and social medicine in Ghana, acupuncture, traveling from China to Tanzania, Algeria, and so on. Chinese primary healthcare is presented in India. The history of socialist healthcare system building in Mozambique, and so on. And these are just a few examples of the work that is going on. And these all are, what we can see emerging from this is Eastern Europeans, Central Europeans popping up all over the place, but it goes all, in all directions, and sometimes not involving Europe at all. And that is one thing that we are thinking about. This is not a comparative analysis; it's a complementary analysis. So we're not putting the pieces of a puzzle together, and we're not comparing, okay, this is what the Polish were doing and this is what the Romanians were doing in I don't know, Korea, North Korea, as opposed to what the East Germans were doing in Africa. What we want is what we came up with, is weaving them together like a tapestry, and that is what we're aiming for. And just to, on a small note, the color scheme of the Connecting Three Worlds website, which is very pink and very blue, that comes from indigenous Mexican tapestries that we used as to signal this. Another very interesting and important question is, and I think that that also came up during lunch in a discussion, is language. So this can, as I said, this can only be done in a collaborative manner, partly because of language. And here I would like to thank the interpreters for the work that they're doing in the back, which shows what happens in an international setting. But it's also a question that we're looking at: how are the people talking to each other? But also a language knowledge that is needed to do this work, because methodologically what we're doing is connecting three worlds in many ways, but the very local, on-the-ground experiences, personal experiences, national policies, international organizations, and that is connected in these analyses, even in the networks that we're seeing. And then finally, just a couple of things. I think I mentioned some of the challenges. So there's the language, there's the, how do we bring this together? What if it doesn't come together? There are always these risks. One question that has been, I've been thinking about, what is the role of Eastern Europe in all this, which is the area that I'm most familiar with. Can this be global history? Can we provincialize Europe? Do we want to provincialize Europe in a global history that we tell? And how could we do that? How could we put back a European history in this that makes sense, that is not Eurocentric in a meaningful way? And Jessica Reinisch had been, one of the people who had been thinking about this for a long time. And what are the sources that we're using for this? And this is also what makes, I think, meaningful global history writing incredibly long, and because you need to go to many sites, you need to read a lot of different types of sources to be able to make sense of it, and not to come away from a kind of master narrative, top-down history, but have something to say to historians of diplomacy and historians of international organizations, not to atomize it into individual experiences, but do have something to say to people doing microhistories and histories of everyday life, and also engage with the national, not lose that lens, because it is important. And I'll leave it at that. I think it was 15 minutes, yeah.
Absolutely, and thank you very much for that. Well, I consciously didn't want to pressure you, but you still saved some time for discussion for us, and thank you very much. Let me consult in a very high-tech mode the program.
I right not to abuse my position as the organizer. I think everyone agrees we can go over by 15 minutes at least. There is just a coffee break. Everyone can quickly grab a coffee and then we can have a
Excellent. Thank you very much. I was going to say that I wouldn't do that, but then still do it. Now we have official leave. So thank you very much for these presentations. what I will do is I will ask two questions as sort of mini tour de tables for you, and then open the floor. You may feel that you want to skip. So if you feel you really don't want to address the question, that's fine. But I still hope you might, because frankly, I was extremely impressed and fascinated listening to you. It's rare that we can really sort of ask ourselves questions of the craft. And I just want to push you a little bit with the first question on the issue of what constitutes sort of the toolbox of global history and how you do it. I mean, you brought some things into play, and I also want to provoke you a little bit concerning that. For instance, is there disagreement about transnational history and global history at this table or not? Bálint, you very consciously sort of argued that global history is something else. Béla, you made the point that there is no real dividing line. What is there? And if I really want to push that envelope, I might even add that when you talk about sort of this dispersionist perspective, that's something that you could use in global histories. And you've actually, when you make the argument, Bálint, about the stock exchanges, is this global dispersionism, or is there something more? So are you just escaping Eurocentrism? And if so, why is that important and maybe a good thing? That's one entry point. So transnational versus global history. The other is maybe more conventional, but leads us to a very evil pit of snakes, as it were. And that's the question of, what is, how does global history relate to the traditional disciplines or sub-disciplines of our craft and to other disciplines? What do we need? I mean, I think Béla, Dóra, you both argued very strongly for the need to have sort of proper empirical history done in certain ways. One of the things that I sometimes have trouble with is when I feel global histories go into a very structuralist mode, as sometimes it happens when the language of choice is that of political economy, for instance. And in some ways you were arguing against that. How do you see that problem? Do we need to think about rescuing the agent here? And who would be the agent, and what would be agency in global history? And is that even relevant to you, so that we avoid an overly structural approach? And these are just some of the problems and some of the ideas that come to mind. Would you reflect on that in no particular order, and just to the extent that you feel that some of these have relevance for you, or add any other sort of methodological considerations and problems that are prominent in your thinking?
Since I have been addressed quite directly, let me grab the possibility to answer first. Global history, as I understand it, has no fixed methodology. It is not even a methodology itself. But there is a certain difference between global and transnational. If you take a comparative history between Hungary and the Czech Republic, that would in quite many cases make sense. It is already transnational, but it's obviously not global. What I mean that when the book consciously tried to expand the scope, that this is where I see the major difference between transnational and global. So wherever it was possible, we were looking for the ways how we can expand our scope to a global, as global as it possible and as it makes sense. For instance, there is a chapter on socialist housing in the book, and there the author quite convincingly argues that how socialist housing and these panel blocks, this technology shaped actually Hungarian life. Approximately every third Hungarian still today lives in such socialist blocks, but the very same structures were built all over the world. Now, why to limit our understanding on Hungary and in East Germany, where the very same technology was used, or why to limit ourselves only to the second world, where this was really a very prominent policy, if the same prominent policy we can find in Brazil, Argentina, and in Nicaragua, and so on and so on. What is the point of that? Well, Eurocentrism, like national history, is an artificial limitation, which in my understanding reduces the chances to grab the whole story. It is like sitting at the family table and there's only the Uncle John who is talking all the way and all the time. And you're just fed up with his stories. You know all his stories by heart, but there are also some other people who may also have some other stories, or who may challenge the story to differentiate the story, and so on and so on. I just don't see the point why this Western Eurocentric perspective should prevail, if not in the cases where it really makes sense. Yeah.
When does it make sense, though?
Well, before the 16th century, you may argue that in quite many cases. So, for instance, before the 16th century and after the fall of antiquity, Catholic Christianity was a Western European phenomenon. If you want to understand intellectual life pretty much shaped by Catholic Christianity in the 14th century, it will be quite obviously rather Eurocentric perspective, because Paris, Bologna, and other major centers of learning informed Hungarian scholars. But if you go further, so closer to our times, then these understandings just are less and less tenable because of the global awareness, which we also show in our book. First, in the very middle of the 16th century, or in Transylvania, the famous cartographer Johannes Honterus printed a map with America on it. So he was already very well aware through his connections in Vienna, Basel, and other German towns that America does exist, and it shall be included into the cartographic knowledge.
Maybe others disagree, agree, or comment on other things.
Thanks. As to the relation of global history to traditional historiographical approaches, I do not think that global history can be defined against political history or other similar branches of history, or global history was defined against these other branches of history. Rather, I think the global history was born out of the idea that the traditional tools and approaches of history are no longer sufficient because of the ongoing globalization. We all know the signs of the globalization, or the factors of the globalization. So basically, it was defined against on the one hand, on the Eurocentric or Western-centered approaches, and on the other hand, related to these against the nation-centered approaches. So this is the major that was the major factor in the emergence of global history. Of course, global history is not the only approach that is critical of the traditional way of history writing. There are other approaches: comparative history, relational history, transnational history, new international history, world history, big history, etc., etc. So there are several other approaches that are critical in that respect. As Bálint suggested, that global history did not have a fixed methodology or a special single methodology, and I would agree on that. At the same time, this does not mean that everything goes. So as the other historians, in my view, as the other historians should always concentrate on the weight significance of different phenomena. This is a major task of global historians as well. So we cannot freely select some aspects of history, and we can do research on that. Sometimes it simply doesn't make sense if we do not weight the significance of these factors.
Could I ask you to clarify, like what would not, like what you mean?
Maybe
with what you said that not anything goes. So what wouldn't go? Like what would you have to? Like what is not something that would be global history?
Once again, I think that we should approach the global history as well in a systematic way. We have to be cautious in that respect, that we should concentrate on what is important and what is less important in history, because that's the major task of historians.
Okay, well, we can maybe, because I'm not clear if this is about methodology or is this about the topic of inquiry?
Rather topic, yeah.
But can you give can you give an example of what wouldn't be a topic that would not merit, what is not important?
Well, I don't want to hurt anybody, so we can discuss this afterwards. But still, I think this is a very straightforward requirement for historians to weight things. And I know this is somewhat provocative. Some historians might felt insulted, sorry, but still, well, in history, everything is the question of measure, to put it differently.
Thanks. I mean,
actually, for sociologists, this is quite obvious. This is quite obvious that there are many, many phenomena in society, and we should concentrate on the mass phenomena, first of all. Of course, other not mass phenomena can also be researched, but we should be explicit about this.
I think we can maybe continue the conversation, because I'm very interested and I don't want to keep you all from that. But I do agree that when I was a journal editor, I would always push back manuscripts on British whatever or American whatever. It's not enough. Tell me why we should read this. Why is this research important? Just because it hasn't been done doesn't mean that it needs to be done. But I think we're talking about something else. But I wanted to make a point about the different topics and global history, because you brought up, I think, something very important in your talk, which was, you said that for instance, some of these books were not dealing with economic history. I mean, they were in the history of ideas, right, and history of concepts and discourse, but not actually, what is the impact. And I think that's such a good way in to say that if you look at cultural history, global history that focuses on culture, you're going to see something. If you look at the kind of economic impact you're going to find a different narrative than what, you know, some of these books are pushing forward. If you look at some aspects of health, you're going to get yet another aspect of it all, which challenge each other in a way and don't really neatly map onto each other. And there will be overlaps, but not necessarily. And that's what moves us forward. But I think that's a big methodological, or I don't know, a challenge in global history, is that, you know, you have the infinite number of perspectives that you can come to it from, and a really wide range of issues that you can write about. And they, you know, how does it then come together, or does it need to come together? Does there need to be like one thing? And that brings just to get back to the question of agents. And I think that's such an important point, and that, you know, just brings me back to Maria's point about, you know, somebody is producing the GDP, right? So it's not just numbers. There are you know, people there who are doing it. Let's see, you know, what they're doing is doing. There are people in the international organizations. There are people in these trade, you know, who come up with the policies. There are people who are doing the doing. There are people who are coming up with the prefab buildings and exchanging ideas. And so that, I think, is a very important element in looking at.
And I fear if we skip agents, then our agency operating, then we'll end up with something very tritely structural. And if we, however, go into that, then we are faced with the dangers that Béla was talking about. Then we fall into this pitfall of sometimes enlarging things. But there's one point that maybe Béla didn't bring up, but it's partly an answer to your question, is of course the question of just how deep globalization needs to run for us to start talking about it as globalization. So in East Central Europe, if, you know, how do you want to weigh it as something that during the socialist period is more superficial, perhaps, or an ambition of certain elites, and maybe much of society is not touched by it as much. I think this is part of the argument that you were making, right? And what does that, you know, what does that entail for the historian's work? Is it something that should you know, shape our choices or not? And I think that's ultimately very hard to decide questions. I will swallow my second question to leave room for questions from you. And please, the floor is open. And well, you know, you're on your own coffee time, so that's how you should phrase your questions. Please, and I think there's a microphone going around, or is there no more microphone? I think if you're just loud enough, we should be just fine, no? Okay, sorry about that, So do wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you. For me, actually, two short questions to Bálint, which I kind of connect to the discussion which is ongoing. The first one is, what was the reflection in your project in both books about exactly the elitizing the narratives and the cases which you are taking? I mean, I think I've heard a little bit when you were talking about the socialist housing, that there is interest also to include like objects which are not like outside of the elite thinking, but exactly I wanted to hear a little bit more about the like intersectional and gender-based reflection which you had. And the second short question is whether you had a kind of case or an object or whatever event which were kind of very debated whether to include it or not, and then at the very end you found it that it's not worthy to be globalized. Thank you.
Next question. Yeah, just making sure that before we move on, the questions here.
Thank you everyone for a great panel. Two quick questions. First is for Bálint. I remember when Global History of Hungary first came out, the first volume, and I was even there at the presentation, and I was kind of reading it and so on. And now is a great time to ask this question. So obviously, I didn't read the second one because it's not out yet. But in the first one, you go from the dualist period until the contemporary period. And in the dualist period, most of the cases you have are regarding Magyar speakers of Hungarian language, whereas you refer to the country, which I'm sure had other you know, how to say, connections to the global space, which are not only done by Hungarian speakers. What was your editorial process behind that? And the second question is for Dóra. Thank you for the great presentation. I saw on one of the slides that you had a podcast within your project, and I tried to find it and I couldn't. So can you please share it with me after the, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all of you for 3 very interesting presentations. 2 very quick questions. The first one, I think all 3 presentations really showed the importance of globalizing Eastern Europe, of placing Eastern Europe in a global context. But my question to you is, what does global history gain from having Eastern Europe? And I think Dóra hinted at this a bit, but I would like to hear more from you in terms of methodologically, epistemologically, theoretically, what does including Eastern Europe contribute to global history, if anything at all? Or is it just important for the region to globalize? The second, again, Dóra offered some wonderful examples, and it's a thing I'm struggling with in my own project. How do you justify your sampling? Because you could have an infinite number of cases that show these connections, that show, you know, global South connecting to Eastern Europe and so on. How do you account for why only these, except for answering to the funders, well, that's all the money you can give me. If you give me 20 times more, I'll give you 20 times more cases. So how do you justify this? Thank you.
You had a question, right? Yes. Yes, thank you. So thank you very much for all these 3 really interesting presentations. A quick comment and then one question or suggestion. The comment, I mean, I think global history also reflects the fact that we have a global audience for the kind of history we produce. So we, or our predecessors, we taught national histories to a national audience. Now, one of the reasons why global history sort of first develops or first comes out really big in California is because California has, for 3 decades, has had some of the most international student bodies. So when Kenneth Pomeranz teaches The Great Divide to an undergraduate class at UC Irvine, well, then 45% of his students will be from East Asia, and he needs to take that into account. I think that's very important to see. I really liked what you said about that we have heard Uncle John's stories often enough, and that it's time to move away from Eurocentric stories. I think it's really good to challenge Eurocentric stories, but I also think it's very important to actually fully to represent them in the way they should be represented. And I think your stock exchange example was a very good example for, if I dare say, misrepresenting the historical evidence. So you quote Rio de Janeiro, Buenos Aires, Lima, and Calcutta as sort of stock exchanges which might finance local enterprises. That's not what they do. The stock exchange exchanges stocks. It's a misnomer for the rest of the world. In the rest of the world, as shown by many scholars, including myself, they sell government bonds, they trade government bonds. So when you have a stock exchange in Buenos Aires and Rio de Janeiro, they basically trade government bonds which were taken out by Uncle John. Okay, so these are English capital exports to Latin America, to British India, and all places you have there, non-European places, perfectly fit into this pattern. So what I'm trying to say is, I think it's really important that we challenge Eurocentric stories and histories, but I also think it's important to see kind of that they are often much more profound than just the name of a place in a faraway place, which is not European, if you like. Thank you.
Let's see how
I'll be brief because I don't want to keep anyone from the coffee. What does I'll take 2 questions. What does Eastern Europe bring to global history? So I had to think about this, and you know, there are good examples I could give you, and through the research that I've done on polio, you know, I think can provide a couple of examples. If you look at it from an Eastern European perspective, for instance, the global Cold War, in the Cold War areas where I'm most familiar with, you see very different things than what you would get from the Soviet American binary. So which is might be different than if you look at it from, I don't know, China, or look at it from Mexico. It also shows the porousness of exchanges. So, and I think that's one of the ways, that we can. It's kind of rewriting narratives and reconceptualizing what it was, what the experience was, and how globally connected. And I think there's a difference here, because Béla is talking about globalization, Bálint is talking about global history, and I'm talking about global health. These are all kind of different things, but they sound the same. And but I think it's challenging some of the very entrenched ways that we think about, which is also means imperial connections. And I know that we have a panel on it, so I'm saving all my questions and remarks for that, and rewriting narratives. And how do we justify the sampling of, how do you choose what to include? I think that's a very important question. I think we started by choosing what not to focus on, and those were what we know a lot about, and also didn't choose, for instance, Cuba as a point of departure, because there are so many people working on it. We wanted to bring something else to the conversation. So I think there's a conceptual and part of it of how one tells the global history of anything, and I think it's only partially possible, and it will always be challengeable. For what we did with the project is saw what people were working on, what proposals they came with, and those became the sites. Didn't assign sites, and that made it organic.
Thank you. First, thank you for the great questions. First, Jan, the book consists of very short chapters, so 4, 5, 6 pages maximum. Therefore, for true intersectional analysis, there was quite little room. Nonetheless, we consciously chose topics about related to several gender questions, and several other minorities we consciously included. So there is, for instance, a chapter on disabled people written by Monika Bár. As far as I know, this is the first book like a first comprehensive Hungarian history book which dedicates a chapter to disabled people at all, because otherwise you see them in a footnote, if at all. Also to sexual minorities, there is a chapter dedicated. Since the project became so long, the problem was not what to leave out, so which are not the good topics, but so we had to measure kind of significance of the topics, and we rather had the problem that there were just too many good topics, so a few of them had to be left therefore out. And this relates to the question of Magyars and non-Magyars. In the first volume, which is about to appear, there will be a few chapters dedicated to incoming migration, whereas in the modern one, it's rather about outgoing migration for obvious reasons. But there will be chapters on German migration, on Jewish migration, and on the Slavic and Armenian migration in the Middle Ages and in the early modern periods. So we tried to focus on the migration aspect, and yes, in a way this is a Magyar-centered story, not because we are blood nationalists, but because to write a story which is relevant for the entire country in a global perspective or in a global context, in the modern age, it is rather the obvious thing that you start with the dominant population. And there will be a chapter, for instance, on the nationalizing state itself. how the government tries to homogenize its heterogeneous population. But the agents of the book are over proportionally Magyar speakers. That's right. I can't recall whether in the transatlantic migration chapter there is a dedicated part about the Slavic people. Perhaps not. Yes, look, we have wrote like 900 pages, and the publisher was really on the brink of collapsing. That just don't do please more. And we are aware that there are several angles which could have been taken into account. I really hope that that in the Romanian and in Slovak context there will be similar book projects which can actually complement our book project. So, and these together in an ideal way, in either word in English, can actually talk to each other. That would be the most ideal scenario. But on the other hand, we had to work also for financial and administrative reasons with Hungarian researchers who are most familiar with Hungarian case studies for linguistic barriers. And so please understand these limitations. I'm also not very happy with the outcome in this respect. Please have some understanding for that. Eurocentrism certainly, and escaping Eurocentrism certainly has to be interpreted in the right way. And actually, thank you so much for pointing out the flow which I just made during the presentation. When I was thinking about which particular chapter to represent, I shortly thought about the risk to talk about something which I'm not familiar with, and this is economic history. And obviously, it was not the most ideal choice. But there is one explanation behind, and this is that there is no the research in depth which you just suggested is not really present. So, and this is actually just one argument, what you said, that these findings, for instance, in this very limited case study, the Hungarian Stock Exchange, and this global contextualization is actually not done by a monograph, a strong study. So, in quite many cases, while we're pushing our authors to consider global aspects, there was actually no real in-depth research behind, because there is no such thing yet. And this book it has, since the chapters are very short, one can actually play with that to have very neatly formed sentences which just can include these global contexts. But I have to admit that in some cases, we just miss an in-depth background research. And I would be very happy if that could change in the following years, and a more and a better grounded similar book could be written in 10 years. I would be very happy with that, without these flaws which just apparently are there.
Actually, I did not receive any questions at that.
Would you like to close our panel with any reflections on everything that's been said?
Wow. We had a very substantial discussion about waiting process in the history writing, if everything goes or not, etc. So we will continue with this.
Der Vorhang zu und alle Fragen noch offen. So
I will get the help of the sociologists.
We end on a Faustian note, so we haven't answered any questions, but at least we started asking them. I hope you have still enough time for coffee. If you would like, I will force these people to line up next to the coffee machine so you can ask them questions.